Hello and welcome to We Are Nantucket. We are grateful to the Massachusetts Department of Education for their grant for the after-school programs and also to the Dreamland Theater Foundation. Who I am most grateful for are the students who have been doing the interviewing, learning the technique of interviews. I think the most important thing about this exercise and project is that the students learn to question and listen very carefully and ask follow-up questions of the adults, and they learn a lot of other people's experiences.
Hi, I'm Albina Tepser. It's January 7th, 2023, and I have the honor of interviewing Joanne Polster, last year's Citizen of the Year. Thank you for coming.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
So how did you come to Nantucket?
June 1st, 1954, I arrived in Nantucket on my honeymoon. I was a new bride. We had just come from New York City. My husband was originally from Boston. He worked and lived at the time in New York, and that's where I met him. And so when we got married, we were looking for a place to go on our honeymoon, of course, and we were very poor. Jobs, of course, in those days didn't pay very much, and we couldn't really afford to travel any great distances. And so my husband suggested that we come to Nantucket because it was so cheap. Now, he knew Nantucket because he had come here when he was a student because a friend of his was custodian of the mill. Let's go there. Interestingly enough, I had worked on the Cape as a waitress when I got out of college. And so we spent our honeymoon in a boarding house. In those days, maybe a widow or someone would open her home and take in boarders who lived there. She took us in because she knew Max's friend. And so we spent our honeymoon in an upstairs room, in an old-fashioned bed. It was just charming. It was very cold. We were not prepared for the cold. There were no shops that we could really afford to buy anything. There was no thrift shop. And of course, in those days, the season started July 4th and ended Labor Day. There was nobody after Labor Day. There wasn't a soul on the island that didn't live here. I knew I loved it and that I wanted to live here. So we came for our vacation the following year. Now, my husband was a musician, and he needed a piano. So all the pianos we ever heard were out of tune, which made him crazy because he was in the business. And so we decided, as long as we love it here, we're going to spend our vacations here, let's buy something. It's amazing what you could have bought in those days. You could buy a house on the cliff for $20,000. You could buy big houses in town for $12,000, $14,000. It was amazing. We're talking 1950, remember. Now Carrie Miller and her brother and her sister had a little complex down on North Water Street. And so we asked her, and she said, yes, I do have a property for sale. And then she told us where it was. He went down, took a look, came back. I found the house. And so I kind of cobbled myself together. We went down. And what do you think it was? It was a 2-car garage with an apartment over it. And we had been looking at mansions, big houses on the cliff, big houses in town. Well, I had just been married. I didn't know you argued with your husband. So we went along with it. So we went back to Carrie Miller and we said, take it. And so she took us to the lawyer's office. It was really the end of our vacation. Put down $40 as a deposit, signed the paper. We had negotiated the price. So where do we go to get a mortgage? She pointed us to Nantucket Bank. Alkin Chadwick was our banker. We applied for a mortgage, and that was the beginning. That's how I got to Nantucket.
Wow. So what was your feeling when you stepped off the boat and saw Nantucket for the first time?
Oh, it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me. I'm a city girl, New York City, used to tall buildings, concrete streets, no gardens. To step off that boat and see this fairy tale village of small houses cobblestone streets, gardens, I was enchanted. It was just like all the picture books and the fairy tale stories that I had read when I was a child. I mean, just imagine coming from a city where the smallest building is 4 stories, and it's all concrete or stone, nothing. Wood houses, I mean, that was such a rarity. And never to see a cobblestone street. And the houses, of course, at that time, Nantucket was very poor. And so the houses were not all spiffed up. The paint was peeling a little bit, the things were comfortable. I'll say that. It had a very comfortable look to it. And there were gardens everywhere. Not the fancy, tricked up gardens, beautifully manicured and all of that. They were wild gardens, just gardens that people planted flowers and they loved them. And you could see them because they were open to the street. And that was something you never saw in New York. You could walk through the streets and it would be like walking through a garden because it would be one after the other. Bill Haddon, who was a local photographer and had a shop on Main Street, he published a couple of years ago a book of his photographs of that period, which was so interesting because you got a real feeling for what it was like. 50, 60, 70 period isn't covered very well. And it was really quite an interesting period because it was the day of the hippie. And we had hippie colonies here. We had all kinds of, not altercations, but Nantucket's very conservative. And in those days, they were extremely conservative. And so you had people, coming in with all these newfangled ideas. And it used to disturb the populace very much because in the summertime, young people would come and they would be mingling, is what they called it. Young people just strolling around, talking to each other, meeting people. And it made people very unhappy. Where these young people stayed was what is now the Jared Coffin House. And it was originally called the Ocean House. And that's where they stayed. And it was, but Labor Day, gone. Everybody gone.
You said there were gardens and it was really not as fancy as you see today. And you said there were hippies too. How has that changed? How has Nantucket changed throughout the years?
Well, Nantucket today is nothing like the Nantucket of the period we're talking about. Up until mid-90s, something like that, Main Street was Main Street. When you needed to buy anything, you went to Main Street. If you started from the bottom, there was a department store on the corner called Butner's. So if you needed underwear or blouses or pajamas, you could get them at Butner's. Then there was a wonderful 10-cent store. You know what a 10-cent store is? One of those they call them general stores now. There was a general store. You could buy anything in the general store. There was a barber. There was a butcher. There was 2 hardware stores. There was Hardee's and Reed's. There was a very funky restaurant, which is now the Lemon Press. There were the 2 drugstores. There was a gift store, Coffin's gift store. Murray's was there, small, very small. The Nobby shop was there, very small. On the corner of Federal Street, there was a furniture store. You got all the news when you went shopping. It was very social that way. That's how Nantucket has changed. That is changed. So now everything is kind of dispersed. So now the Main Street is the Stop and Shop, the aisles of the Stop and Shop.
When you came to Nantucket, you had a job in New York, right?
Yeah, I have always been in the publishing, in the book business, working in bookshops, libraries, publishers, and I ran an art library in New York for a while. And then finally did picture research, which was all those textbooks that you're reading, somebody had to find the pictures that are in those textbooks. So I did that until the early 2000s when digitization began to take over business pretty much. And they put a lot of picture agencies, put all their material online. So that the publishers didn't really need picture editors. or picture researchers. Gradually, the business kind of died down.
How did you get a job in Nantucket? What were your jobs here?
Oh, my husband had died by this time, and I decided that I would come to Nantucket and see what's there. Most of my friends at that time had either moved to Florida or had died. There was nothing really to hold me in New York, except my family. So I began to spend more and more time here. So I volunteered at the thrift shop. And that took a couple days. So then I thought, I'll volunteer at the library. Libraries always could use people. So I started to do that. So it was essentially volunteer work. And then I decided I really want to get paid for some of this. So a friend of mine suggested I go to the NHA. And I did. I applied to be an interpreter, and I was hired. Now, and they still do it today, but at that time, all of the sites had what they called interpreters, people who were on site who gave tours to people who were visiting the sites, the oldest house, the mill, the Greater Light, the jail, the fire hose cart house. So all of those sites had people on them. So that's what I used to do. I used to be at different houses, depending on what the schedule was, and give talks about the buildings and the history of Nantucket. I did walking tours for a while. And I had volunteered to do some gardening for the NHA. So I've been doing that for years, the last couple of years. But plus the other things. I mean, I still have a schedule. I work for the Life Saving Museum, Mariah Mitchell, the Unitarian Church, the thrift shop, the Athenaeum. I give every day somewhere else.
Wow. So you've contributed to Nantucket so much. You've volunteered here and there. You've done so many things.
And it's contributed to me because I'd be a lump. I could not survive if I didn't have things to do.
Wow. You've described both New York and Nantucket. What about the people that live there?
Live?
Yeah, so
Where?
the people
Here?
in Nantucket, what are they like?
You mean when in the earlier days, you mean? They're very conservative, and they're very, not overly friendly, let's say. One lesson we learned very early in the game, and that was never, ever badmouth or criticize or say anything negative about anybody, because you could say something to someone on the corner of Martin's Lane and Fair Street, and in 10 minutes, the person that you were down bad-mouthing would know, because the person that you were speaking to was related to them and would convey the message. It was really one of the things you learned very easily, so you always had to be very positive or very neutral. So that was a very good lesson to learn. I don't think that's so true anymore. You remember when we came here in 1954, there were only 3,000 people living here year-round. Now it's something like, 20,000, 15,000? I mean, one time, I remember we had a postman. We were only here two weeks out of the year, remember. We were walking past the post office one day, on Saturday, and the postman leaned out the window and said, "Hey, Max, I have a certified letter for you." That's people. At that time, if you wrote just your name, Nantucket, Massachusetts, without an address, you would get your mail.
Thank you so much for coming here and for doing the interview. It's been great.
Well, I feel so honored, really, that you've taken the time to listen. But I've told you stories. Now you have to tell stories. Now you have an obligation to tell stories, because I've told you a lot of stories.